Hi, I can't resist purchasing vintage swimwear and lingerie sewing patterns when I see them in secondhand shops. I've got quite a collection now. And recently on my Instagram, I put out to vote which pattern I should use to sew a swimsuit. The one you chose was this vintage simplicity pattern. So keep watching as I sew up this vintage pattern with a few modern construction techniques. So I'm going to be making this Simplicity 8028, which is a pattern printed in 1977. I'm going to be sewing up this one-piece bathing suit here, and opening up the pattern, there's a few things I'm going to need to look at before I start cutting up any fabric. The first is the sizing. So if I look on the back of the pattern envelope here, this pattern contains only size 10. So size 10 fits me okay in the bust, but my waist starts getting up to a size 12 and my hips in the size 14. So what I'm going to do is compare these pattern pieces to pieces from a tried and true pattern that I've already made that I know fits me, and just see if there's any pattern adjustments I'm going to need to make before I start cutting. Then the second thing is opening up these pattern pieces. They're uncut, which is great, but they also have a big 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. When I'm sewing swimwear, I much prefer to sew with a small 6mm 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to trace these pattern pieces off with a smaller seam allowance allowed for. And then glancing through the instructions, I need to decide whether I'm going to follow the instructions exactly as is, or rely on my experience in swimwear sewing to maybe change up the method of construction a little bit. So the first thing I noticed was the leg elastic here. They have you sew a casing for the elastic and feed the elastic into that tunnel. I'm not going to do it like this. I think that's going to look quite homemade. I much prefer when the elastic is attached to the fabric. So I'm already going to change that method of construction. Then I noticed that the bottom half of the suit is not lined. I prefer a lining in my swimsuits. It just makes me feel a little bit more comfortable knowing there are 2 layers of fabric there. So I'm definitely going to be lining the full inner of my swimsuit, and that means I can change up this bit of construction where it has the lining of the bra bit only, and it's suggesting that you slip stitch it to the seam where it meets the bottom half of the swimsuit. I'm going to be wearing this swimsuit, and I don't think that is going to be very durable to have that slip stitched down. So my inner piece is going to be fully lined. That means that I can do away with a few pattern pieces. So for example, I won't need this little crotch piece because it will already be lined with my full lining. And I'm not going to need these facing pieces where the keyholes are, because again, my lining is going to do that job. So if I flip it over to the pattern pieces here, I'm going to need to cut out my front, my back, the bra front and the bra back, and not worry about the 2 lining or the crotch pieces. So I'm going to trace off these 4 pieces with my new seam allowance and then cut out the fabric. I've made myself a wee checklist of the changes that I wanted to make. So first up on that was compare to a tried and true pattern. For that one, I chose the Ava panties by Olulu. I've made these into bikini bottoms quite a few times and the fit is really good. They're also high-waisted, so it gave me a nice comparison to this back pattern piece. And as expected, this is slightly too narrow in the hip area, so I've added on a little bit of width through the hip and a tiny amount through the waist. I also made those changes to the front pattern piece. Next on my list was to trace with a 6mm seam allowance. You can see my pieces here that I've done that too. So I have my main back piece and the little back extension here. I've got my main front piece and the tie extension that goes with that. So now I get to cut these out of my fabric. I need to do 4 of this in the main fabric because you will see the inside once it is tied. The other 3 pieces, I just need the 2 halves in my outer fabric, my main fabric, and then the 2 halves in my lining fabric. But before I cut that out, I'm going to show you which fabric I'm going to use. The fabric I'm using is one of my absolute favourite swimwear fabrics. It is recycled nylon, so from post-consumer waste. I've got swimsuits in this fabric that are 3 or 4 seasons old and they still look absolutely brand new. The colour is perfect and there's no bagging out or anything. So this is my absolute favourite. The one I'm using is this beautiful bright tomato red. And then I've got my lining fabric as well. Again, it is a recycled fabric. Then I also need 2 G-hooks. So I've got options here in either rose gold or silver. I'll decide on that closer to the time once it's made up. But I can start cutting out this gorgeous fabric. At the time of filming, this tomato red colour is available in the Nellie Joans shop, nelliejoans.co.nz, and there's also a range of loads of other gorgeous colours as well. So my first step is to sew the centre front and centre back seams together on both my main fabric and my lining fabric. Here is my lining, the back pieces. So I'm just going to flip these right sides together and pin along this seam here. I'm using these fine patchwork pins by Clover. I really like them for lingerie sewing because they are nice and fine. So I will pop a link to those in the description, but I'm just going to pin along here, do the same with my front lining piece, and then sew this with the 6mm seam with my overlocker. Overlocked up the back and front seams on both my outer fabric and my lining fabric. My next thing is to attach them together at the back opening keyhole and the front keyhole. So I'm just going to pop them right sides together, front to front and back to back, and overlock that seam there together so that I can flick that out and have a fully lined front and back piece. My keyholes for the front and back are complete, so I have 2 lined pieces, a front and a back. To sew that seam with the overlocker, I just straightened it out as I sewed, straightened out the curve, and then I've also, with a zigzag stitched, understitched the seam allowance to the lining just to help prevent the lining from rolling out once it's worn. I've got my front piece here. It's now time to add on the bust and tie piece. I've got the notch marked out here where it joins this point, and what I'm going to do is just move that down so we can see. Contrary to the instructions, I'm going to add a little bit of elastic along the underarm just to give that a bit of extra support. So I don't need to sew this seam just yet. So what I do need to do is attach it to here, carry on sewing around the tie and then up to the neckline. And I'm going to do that by turning that over. Make sure I've got the correct side. No, I don't. That one goes underneath. So I'm going to sandwich this main body piece between my 2 tie pieces. So it's going to go like that, and then like this. So I've got a sandwich of a tie piece, my main front body, and the other tie piece, lining up this with my notches, and I'm going to sew across this seam to here and then move my body piece off to the side and out of the way so that I can complete sewing this seam here. So I'm going to pin this bit together first, sew that on the overlocker, and then do the second seam. Sewn this seam here. As you can see, it's starting to take shape, looking like a swimsuit. So now I need to sew this part here together, but to do that I'm going to turn them back so they face each other and just move the body of my swimsuit off to the side seam there so that it's not going to get caught up when I sew this seam. Pop that together and overlock along this edge. So I've sewn up here. This is the neckline and the tie. Now I can turn it right sides out. Flip that around. And we're all nicely finished along the seam line edges here. So I've just got to repeat those steps so I can add my tie onto this side, and then we'll move on to the back piece. Here we are, coming along nicely with the front half of the togs. I've got the seams finished all around the outside here. These are the bits that get tied together in the middle. Now I'm going to move on to the back bit, which is a lot more straightforward. We're doing a similar process with the back part. I've got the little extensions that, find out the right side, will end up like this to create the little back extension and the extra part to attach the G-hook onto. So I'm just going to sandwich this part between the two. I've got my notch there so I know where to end. So that part will go like that, and this part underneath everything. So I've got my sandwich of the outer back extension, the inner main part of the back, and the lining of the back extension, and then I will just sew those along this seam here. I don't need to finish what will be the top because that will have my elastic attached, and this end part will just fold under the G-hook. I just need to sew my 6 more seam allowance across these two edges here. These seams are sewn, so you can flip them up as they would be worn. I am going to give everything a light press later. Usually I would do it as I go, but I don't happen to have my iron with me at the moment. So now I need to pop my front and my back pieces together and attach them along the side seams. So bring them in right sides together. I will pin and stitch along the side seam here And we're getting pretty close to seeing some actual togs taking shape. Pinning, I need to make sure I'm getting all 4 layers together. So that is the 2 lining layers and the 2 main fabric layers. I'm going to pin at the bottom. I'm going to pin at my side seams here. It is quite bulky at this side seam, so what I'm going to do is sew a small section first just on my sewing machine, baste it together so that I know I've got my seams nicely lined up in the middle. If I just went ahead and sewed with the overlocker, then there's a chance that one of them is going to shift and we will end up with the 2 seams not matching. So I do like to just baste that together first. So I'm just going to pin around my seam, baste it together until I'm happy with how that looks, and then sew it on the overlocker. Sew that little section and open it up and make sure my seams lined up. Here is my little basting section to get my seams lined up, and they're lining up not too bad on the inside. So I am going to go ahead and finish this side seam, overlocking the whole way down on both sides. The side seams are sewn up. It is looking very cute. I've just got to attach the crotch seam together now, and I want to do that so it's an enclosed seam. So the way I'm going to do that is turn the swimsuit inside out. I want the 2 right sides of my main swimwear fabric facing each other, and I'm going to alternate the way the seams fall so I can butt that join together. Make the seams nice and crisp. The next one, the lining on my front piece goes next. It'll be right side facing up. Make sure that seam is lined up with that one. And then to create the enclosed seam, I need to bring this back piece around to the front so that it's right sides together with my front lining piece, and make sure I don't twist it as I go. So I want this bit to come forward. The main part of my swimsuit will be bunched up in the middle there. So this one joins the stack on top. So I've got my back liner right sides together with my inner liner for the front, then the front main piece, and then the back main piece right sides together. And when that is pinned and sewn, it's going to create a nice enclosed seam with the seam laying towards the back of the swimsuit. So I'm going to pop a pin in here. Line up each edge. And zip across there with the overlocker. Here that is sewn up, and then we should be able to turn the swimsuit out, and we've got a nicely enclosed seam. Staggering or alternating the way your seam allowances fall make for a really nice crisp intersection of your seams, so it's a good idea to do that. See, it looks looking good on both sides. So I am going to, because I made the slight modifications to the pattern around the hip area, I'm actually going to try this on before I add the elastics, just so I know or get a good idea on how much I need to stretch the elastics as I put them on, and fingers crossed it fits. So we're up to the finishing off parts. I've tried it on and my changes mean that it fits really well. So now we're up to sewing on the elastic. I've just popped some pins in to hold my lining and my main fabric together as I'm sewing. And I like to apply swimwear elastic. I'm using a rubber swimwear elastic here. I like to apply it with first pass with my overlocker and then second with a zigzag on my sewing machine. So the first pass, I just line up the outside of the elastic with the cut edge of the leg here of the swimsuit, and do it on the inside of the swimsuit. So I'm just going to go along and overlock that together, stretching very slightly as I sew, and I give it a little bit more stretch around the bum area. So that's going to be my first step, and then I'll come back for step 2. Here is the swimwear elastic overlocked onto the edge of the swimsuit. The next step is to turn it towards the inside, and then from the right side of the garment I'm going to do a 3-step zigzag to hold that in place. Before I do that part, I'm going to add the swimwear elastic first pass onto the top of the swimsuit. So I flip it over to the back. So this is where I'm adding the elastic edge along the top of the back of the swimsuit, extending along up the strap. So this didn't originally have any elastic in it. I'm just popping it in there as a little bit of extra seam support, so I'm not going to stretch it too much around this area. I'm just going to apply it in exactly the same way with the overlocker, but just not stretching it as much. Here I'm using my sewing machine to sew the second pass of the elastic with a 3-step zigzag. The settings are 5 wide and 1.6 long, and I don't stretch out the fabric, I just open it out enough to smooth it out and make sure there's no wrinkles in the fabric. I've done the second pass of sewing the elastic onto the leg holes and along the neckline. I did that with a 3-step zigzag. You can see finishing the edge nicely there and along the top of the strap. So my final task is to pop the G-hooks on to the back. So this is the G-hook here that I'm using. Tells me to pop them onto this side, thread that end through there and attach that to the back, and then we need to just create a loop on this side, so once it's ready to be closed, it will close actually. It needs to be that way up. So once we're ready to close it, that just slips on there and creates our back fastener. I'm just going to do a straight stitch down to secure both of those and repeat with the neckline. I'm just going to baste the neckline on though and try it on before I sew it, just to make sure that it is the right distance for me. Yeah, we are almost finished. Thank you for watching. I really recommend this sewing pattern. I had a lot of fun sewing it up. If you're not lucky enough to spot one of these in a secondhand shop, then I'm going to put a few suggestions of some modern sewing pattern equivalents up after this. Now, I really like the fit of this swimsuit. There's only one small adjustment I would make if I was to make it again, and that is to shorten the bodice by about 1 centimeter. This underbust seam just hits me a little bit high, and if I pull it down, I get a few wrinkles in the bodice of the swimsuit. Other than that, I really love it and can't wait to debut it at the pool. Be sure to head on over to Instagram and follow along at Nellie Joans so you can be involved in the next vote on which sewing pattern I'm going to make. And subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can check out those videos.